Before video games, before streaming, before the internet, a group of guys sitting around a table in Wisconsin invented something that changed gaming forever. This is the story of how Dungeons & Dragons was born. Two men, a basement, 1,000 copies of a rulebook, and an idea nobody had tried before. Let's get into it. To understand D and AMP, D, you need to understand wargames. In the 1950s and early 1960s, a popular hobby was playing tabletop wargames. These were board games that recreated real battles from history. Players moved small soldiers and tanks around a map. Dice decided who won each fight. Games like Avalon Hill's Gettysburg were big hits. Two kids on opposite sides of the country got hooked on Gettysburg around the same time. Their names were Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. They didn't know each other yet, but they were both already thinking about how to make war games better. Gary Gygax grew up in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. He was born in 1938 and moved to Lake Geneva at age 7. He became obsessed with war games and spent his nights and weekends designing new ones. He joined a group called the International Federation of Wargamers, IFW, and became well known in that world. Dave Arneson grew up in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. He also loved war games and played them with a tight group of friends. His group was run by a man named Dave Weasley, who created a special type of war game called Braunstein. Braunstein was different. Instead of controlling a whole army, each player controlled one single person, one character, with their own goals inside the battle. Weasley decided what happened based on what the players chose to do. This was a huge idea. It was basically the earliest version of what we now call role-playing. In 1969, Gygax attended Gen Con, a gaming convention he helped create in Lake Geneva. It was there that he met Dave Arneson for the first time. The two men shared a love of war games and became friends. They even co-wrote a naval war game together called Don't Give Up the Ship in 1971. That same year, 1971, Gygax co-developed a game called Chainmail with another designer named Jeff Perrin. Chainmail was a miniature war game based on medieval combat. Instead of armies, it focused on individual fighters, one figure, one person. It even had a fantasy supplement at the back with wizards, monsters, and spells like Fireball. Chainmail was important because it brought combat down to a human level, one warrior against another. That was a step towards something bigger. By 1971, Dave Arneson was bored with Napoleonic war games. He wanted something new. He took two ideas and smashed them together, Wesley's Braunstein style, where players each control one character with their own story. The fantasy rules from Gygax's Chainmail, with wizards, heroes, and monsters. The result was a campaign Arneson called Blackmoor. Here is how it worked. Players each picked a character. They explored a dungeon under a castle called Castle Blackmoor. They fought monsters. They found treasure. Their characters grew stronger over time through something Arneson invented called experience points. Each session connected to the last. It was one ongoing story. Arneson also invented other things we now take for granted: character classes, armor class, and level advancement. These were all brand new ideas. He described his inspiration like this. He had spent 2 days watching monster movies, reading Conan books, and doodling on graph paper. He was tired of rigid Napoleonic rules, and he wanted something more personal and imaginative. The first documented Blackmoor game session took place on April 17, 1971. In the winter of 1972-1973, Dave Arneson traveled to Lake Geneva to show his game to Gygax. He sat down with Gygax and a small group of local players, including Gygax's own son Ernie, and ran them through a Blackmoor session. Gygax's group went into a dungeon, fought a troll, got hit by a fireball from a wizard, chased down ogres, and used a magic sword. According to eyewitnesses, the session was electric. Gygax was hooked immediately. He saw what Arneson had built, a game where players were the heroes of their own story, where imagination was the only limit, and he knew it was something special. Something no one had ever published before. The two men agreed to work together. Gygax and Arneson started collaborating on a set of rules. They called the project the Fantasy Game. Gygax did most of the final writing. He tested ideas on his kids and a growing group of players in Lake Geneva. He created his own campaign setting called Greyhawk to run his games. His group grew to over 20 players. Arneson kept sharing notes from Blackmoor as Gygax shaped the rules into a final draft. The two men had different visions on some of the details. The final text had changes that Arneson had not approved. This would cause conflict later, but for now, they had a game. Gygax tried to get it published. He went to Guide on Games, too small. He went to Avalon Hill. They didn't understand role-playing and turned it down. So Gygax decided to publish it himself. In 1973, Gygax and his childhood friend Don Kay each put in $1,000. Kay borrowed his share against his life insurance policy and founded a company. They called it Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR. They printed exactly 1,000 copies of the game. The full title was Dungeons & Amp, Dragons, Rules for Fantastic Medieval. Wargame campaigns. Playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. The box contained 3 small booklets. Volume 1, Men and Amp, Magic, Character Creation and Spells. Volume 2, Monsters and Amp, Treasure, Creatures and Loot. Volume 3, The Underworld and Amp, Wilderness Adventures, How to Explore and Run the Game. The total production budget was just $2,000. There was only $100 set aside for artwork. Gygax had to ask friends, family members, and local artists to draw pictures. The game was published in January 1974. It was sold out of Gygax's basement in Lake Geneva. There were no ads, no marketing, just word of mouth. Within 10 months, all 1,000 copies had sold out. D&AMP was not like anything before it. Here is what made it new. One player became the Dungeon Master, DM. The DM told the story, controlled the world, and decided what happened. Every other player controlled one character. Characters had stats. Numbers like strength, intelligence, and dexterity defined what your character could do. This was new. Dice decided outcomes. Players rolled dice, including the new 20-sided die, to see if their actions succeeded or failed. Characters grew over time. You earned experience points. You leveled up. Your character got stronger the more you played. There was no board. The game happened in your imagination. The DM described the world and you reacted. There was no fixed path, no winner, no end condition. The story could go anywhere. This was the first modern role-playing game. It created an entirely new category of game that had never existed before. Gygax and Arneson did not invent the fantasy world from nothing. They borrowed from the books they loved. The biggest influence was J.R.R. Tolkien. The presence of elves, dwarves, halflings, orcs, and adventuring parties all came from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The similarities were so close that Tolkien's estate threatened legal action. TSR had to change some names. Hobbits became halflings, Balrogs became Baelors, and Ents became Trants. Gygax also drew from Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, pulp fantasy fiction, mythology, and history. He later listed his literary influences in a section of the Dungeon Master's Guide called Appendix N. After 1974, D&AMP grew fast. Early players formed clubs. Copies spread through universities and hobby shops. New players found the game and told their friends. In 1976, Gygax launched a magazine called The Dragon to support the growing community. TSR moved out of Gygax's basement and into a real office, the Dungeon Hobby Shop in Lake Geneva. In 1977, TSR released 2 major products, the D&AMP D-Basic Set, a simplified version for new players, edited by J. Eric Holmes. Advanced Dungeons & Amp, Dragons, AD&AMP, a more complex and complete version of the game. But the growth came with problems. Gygax and Arneson disagreed on creative direction. Arneson was briefly hired by TSR, but was let go after 10 months. When TSR released AD&AMP, Gygax refused to pay Arneson royalties on it, claiming it was a different product from the original D&AMP. In 1979, Arneson sued TSR. They settled in 1981, with Arneson receiving a 2.5% royalty on all AD&D products. Things got worse at TSR through the early 1980s. Business decisions Gygax didn't agree with piled up. He eventually sold his last shares in TSR in 1985, leaving the company he co-founded. Gary Gygax died on March 4, 2008, in Lake Geneva, the same city where he had once sold D&D out of his basement. Dave Arneson died on April 7, 2009. After Gygax left, TSR kept going, but eventually ran into financial trouble. In 1997, Wizards of the Coast bought TSR. Then in 1999, Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast. And that is who owns D&D today. D&D went through multiple editions over the decades. The 5th edition, released in 2014, became the most popular version ever. D&D hit mainstream culture through shows like Stranger Things and live play streams on platforms like Twitch and YouTube. Today, millions of people play D&D in over 50 countries. It has spawned video games, books, movies, and an entire industry of accessories and tools. All of it traces back to two men, a card table, a model of a castle, and a dungeon in their imagination. Here is what is remarkable about this story. D&D was rejected by publishers. It was made on a $2,000 budget. It was sold from a basement. It was not supposed to work. But it gave people something they had never had before. A game with no fixed story, no fixed ending, and no limit on what was possible. It put players in the middle of their own adventure and let them choose what happened next. That idea, that you could sit around a table with your friends and build a world together, turned out to be something millions of people were hungry for. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson didn't just make a game. They invented a new way to tell stories.